Have you ever felt guilty for not having a clear purpose in life? Have you ever wondered why, even after reading books, taking courses, and seeking answers, the emptiness is still there, silent, staring back at you? The truth is, the search for purpose has become the new form of modern imprisonment. We no longer want to live. We want to justify our own existence. Everyone talks about purpose, about living your mission, finding your why, following your inner truth. But no one talks about the weight this search can carry, because deep down, the more we try to find purpose, the more it seems to hide, and the guilt begins to grow. Why does everyone seem to know what they want in life? Except me? With every motivational video, every guru saying, you were born for something great, an invisible wound is born too. The feeling of not being enough until that something great finally appears. We live in an era where purpose has become the new form of success. People no longer just want to win, they want to matter. But in this race, to be someone with purpose, the simple act of existing has started to feel like it's not enough. And there lies the lie. What we call purpose is often just a disguised attempt to escape fear. The fear of emptiness, of silence, of feeling lost. We seek meaning, but what we really want is anesthesia. Maybe the problem isn't not having a purpose, but believing we need one to deserve to live. And it's that belief that imprisons us. We've created a spirituality of performance, where even the soul must be productive. And when purpose doesn't appear, what we feel isn't peace, it's failure. Life then becomes a spreadsheet of spiritual goals, and what should free us begins to suffocate. But what if purpose isn't a destination? What if it's merely a byproduct of a life lived with presence, not a goal to be achieved? It's at this point that the story changes its tone. The Romanian philosopher Cioran said that man invented meaning simply to endure. The fact of existence. The French sociologist Jean Baudrillard saw in this a reflection of consumer society. Even the sacred has turned into a product. And the Swiss writer Alain de Botton reminds us that the role of philosophy is not to blame us for being lost, but to console us while we learn to walk. This video is about that, the hidden side of purpose, about the moment when the desire for meaning turns into a prison, and about the courage, simple, silent, yet profoundly human, to keep going, even without knowing why. Most people aren't searching for a purpose. They're trying to escape from themselves. They say they want a sense of life, but what they're really seeking is an antidote to the emptiness they feel upon waking. Cioran said, that man invented meaning merely to endure the fact of existence. And perhaps that's true, because deep down, what we call purpose is our most sophisticated attempt to hide fear, the fear of being irrelevant, of leaving nothing behind, of being just another forgotten name in the sands of time. Why haven't I discovered my purpose yet? Is living without a mission the same as living wrongly? These are the questions that echo within an exhausted generation, exhausted from comparing, from self-demand, from believing there's some cosmic plan waiting to be decoded. Alain de Botton argues that philosophy should console us, not oppress us. But what modern spirituality does is exactly the opposite. It turns the sacred into a goal, silence into guilt, and the simple act of existing into a task. And so, the more we try to find ourselves, the further away we drift from who we are. The truth is, we've turned the life purpose into just another product of consumer society. Baudrillard warned, everything that man touches becomes a commodity, even the soul. And that's exactly what we see today. Purpose is sold like perfume, promising essence, but made of mere appearance. We buy books, courses, retreats, and awakenings, believing something out there will reveal who we are in here. But real purpose is never delivered in boxes, nor does it appear in marketing formulas. It's what remains when all illusions have stopped working. The void, that space we so deeply fear, is the cradle of everything true, but we'd rather build bridges over the sea of the unknown than learn to float within it. Cioran noted, that man is the only animal that needs to justify his own existence. And that's why, instead of simply living, we keep trying to explain why we're alive. Yet meaning doesn't appear through searching, it reveals itself through surrender. Purpose isn't born from the effort to find it, but from the courage to stop running away. And it's precisely when we stop, when we finally surrender to what we don't understand, that the next illusion arises. That purpose must be great, divine, transformative, that the value of a life lies in the magnitude of its mission. And this is where purpose stops being a bridge and becomes a showcase, the new synonym for spiritual success. Before, the pressure was to be someone in life. Now it's to have a higher purpose. The vocabulary changed, but not the anxiety. Society learned to give a spiritual polish to the same old race. Today, anyone without a purpose seems incomplete, almost guilty. Baudrillard says that consumption is not about possessing things, but about possessing meanings. And that's what we've done with spirituality. We've turned purpose into status. The world no longer cares how much you earn, but how much you vibrate. Social media has become a showcase for enlightenment. Everyone displays their awakening, as if showing off invisible medals. There's a silent competition. Who's more conscious, more healed, more connected with the universe? Spirituality has become a performance. And paradoxically, the more people try to prove they have purpose, the emptier they feel. It's the same game as before, just with new rules. The mask changed shape, but the fear remains the same. The fear of not being enough. De Botton said that philosophy should restore our dignity, not our guilt. But it's guilt that drives this new spiritual race. Guilt for not being productive enough, for not feeling enough, for not being in the flow. As if the soul had a stopwatch and existence were a cosmic marathon. What was once an inner journey has become an existential resume, full of invisible titles: healer, therapist, mentor, being of light. Deep down, we've only changed the name of the trophy. The irony is that the more we chase this higher purpose, the further it seems to drift away. It's the same phenomenon as material success. Once it becomes a goal, it becomes unattainable. The soul doesn't work under goals. It reveals itself in silence. But the ego wants to show results, to measure the invisible, to be seen. And at that point, purpose ceases to be freedom and becomes tyranny, because everything we do becomes heavy, measured, justified. The simple act of living is no longer enough. And when purpose becomes this kind of new religion, a deep question arises. Could what we call purpose simply be the modern disguise of vanity? Maybe what drives us isn't the will to serve, but the desire to be admired for serving. Cioran would say, that man cannot bear the idea of being ordinary, and perhaps that inability to simply be is what keeps us imprisoned. The ego is a disguised master. It wears the clothes of purpose and speaks with the voice of the soul. But what it truly wants is applause. It wants to be remembered, recognized, and important. Cioran comments, that man cannot bear the idea of being ordinary, and perhaps that is why many seek a purpose not to serve the world, but to save themselves from insignificance. They want to change the world, but what they really want is for the world to notice. It changed because of them. And when recognition doesn't come, we call it an existential crisis, which is actually just the frustration of an ego that hasn't been applauded. The ego is impatient. It wants purpose to be grand, visible, almost epic, as if the soul needed spotlights to exist. But the soul is silent. It works behind the scenes. In the small things, no one notices. While the ego seeks the extraordinary, the spirit reveals itself. In the simple, a gardener may be more aligned with the meaning of life than a guru with millions of followers. But the ego doesn't accept that. It wants a stage. It wants proof, and thus turns the sacred into spectacle. When purpose is guided by ego, it stops being a path and becomes a showcase. Everything must now serve a goal. Even kindness becomes strategy, and silence becomes content. De Botton reminded us that a good life doesn't need to be grand, only coherent. But we live in times when even coherence needs branding. People no longer meditate to be at peace. They meditate to post about being at peace, and the result is an anxious spirituality, a soul that runs when what it most needs is to stop. There's a deep difference between serving the world and serving oneself through it. The first is born of surrender. The second, of the need to prove worth. And it's easy to confuse them, because from the outside, both can look the same. But inside it's a different story. The ego thrills at every like, every compliment, every sign of validation. The soul, on the other hand, finds meaning in what remains unseen. When one understands this, they discover that true purpose requires no witnesses, but few are willing to face that silence. Few can bear the emptiness of not being seen. It's at this point that the search for purpose blends with the search for identity, and who am I becomes who do they expect me to be? And from that confusion, the next trap is born. The market notices the fear behind spirituality and turns even the sacred into a product. The market has discovered that selling meaning is more profitable than selling happiness. The promise has changed shape, but the trick remains the same. Now, it's not just about selling what you should have, but who you should be. Baudrillard had already warned. We live in an era where even the invisible is consumed, and purpose became exactly that, an existential product packaged in words like authenticity, fulfillment, mission. Capitalism has learned to colonize even the soul. and we buy, smiling, believing that enlightenment can be paid in 12 installments. The culture of guilt flourishes in this fertile soil. If you're not happy, it's because you didn't meditate enough. If you still feel fear, it's because you didn't manifest correctly. If your purpose hasn't appeared, it's because you're not aligned with your frequency. The discourse sounds profound, but it's perverse, because it places the weight of the world on the shoulders of those already tired of self-blame. De Botton said philosophy should offer us comfort, but modern spirituality turned comfort into obligation. Now, even peace has an expiration date. The truth is, real purpose was never a destination. It's a form of presence. But people have been convinced that it's hidden somewhere exotic. In a course, a guru, a distant mountain, the purpose industry thrives on the promise that the meaning of life is always one step ahead. Thus, the seeker becomes a loyal consumer. The more they search, the emptier they feel. The emptier they feel, the more they consume. It's the perfect circle of spiritual dependence. The cruelest part is that all this disguises itself as self-love. The phrases are beautiful. The intentions seem noble. But behind the shine lies the old logic of scarcity. You're never enough, never ready, never awake enough. Cioran states, that man is an animal that feels bad about existing, and perhaps the purpose industry has only refined this discomfort. It doesn't want you to find yourself. It wants you to keep searching. And that's when fatigue sets in. The soul, exhausted from so much evolving, begins to suspect that perhaps meaning isn't in another course, but in the simple act of stopping. And in that fatigue, a new clarity is born, the one that silently asks, what if purpose isn't something to be found, but something to be lost? There are those who live, waiting for the day when everything will finally fall into place. The day when pain will make sense, the past will justify itself, and life will reveal its great hidden purpose. It's a beautiful and, at the same time, cruel hope, because that day never comes. Meaning isn't at the end of the road. It happens in the middle of the dust, between stumbles and pauses. But the mind, impatient, craves coherent endings. It wants to believe there's an explanation for everything, as if life were a well-written novel. Yet life is more like a draft, and perhaps that's exactly where its beauty lies. De Botton said, we search for the meaning of life, the same way we search for love, believing it will save us. But meaning doesn't save, it accompanies. It's a silent companion that only appears when we stop trying to trap it. And yet, we spend years believing there's a finish line, an existential arrival point, where suffering finally dissolves. But suffering isn't a mistake in the journey. It's the very map that guides us. Pain isn't outside the path. It is the path. The problem is, we were taught to live for a later, after the degree, after the career, after the purpose, always after. Cioran argues, that man is the animal condemned to consciousness, and perhaps that is why we spend our lives trying to escape it, projecting our salvation into the future. We want to believe there's a moment when everything lights up, because it's easier to wait for revelation than to accept chaos. But chaos, that apparent enemy, is the only thing real enough to teach us how to live. Meaning doesn't reveal itself in grand epiphanies. It whispers through small gestures, in the coffee shared without hurry, in the conversation that heals without intent, in the silence that stops being uncomfortable and becomes a refuge. It's in those intervals, not in the goals, that purpose manifests, when the present ceases to be a means and becomes an end in itself. And perhaps it's precisely this realization that prepares us for the next turning point. When we realize that purpose, which once seemed a distant star, can become an invisible prison. There comes a moment when purpose, which once felt like a compass, turns into a cell. It all begins with good intentions, wanting to do something meaningful, to contribute, to leave a mark. But little by little, meaning becomes a demand. Every gesture must have utility. Every day must serve a mission. And when nothing seems to have purpose, guilt is born, the feeling of wasting one's own life. Cioran said that there is nothing more depressing than living under the tyranny of meaning. He was right. Meaning, when imposed, suffocates. It's subtle, the moment when the search turns into a prison. The person who once wanted to understand life begins to fear stillness, emptiness, silence. They start measuring everything by how close or far it is from their mission. But the true purpose is not a metric. It's breath. It's not achieved. It manifests. And sometimes it manifests precisely when we stop insisting. Like the wind, the more you try to grasp it, the less it stays. The soul, like the wind, cannot bear to be controlled. Purpose becomes a prison when the ego takes the place of presence, when every action must prove worth and every pause feels like failure. De Botton would say that a meaningful life is not one with constant purpose, but one with moments of sincerity. Not every day needs to be epic. Some just need to be human. But we live intoxicated by a high-performance spirituality, one that promises light, but demands productivity. What should liberate has become yet another unreachable goal. We sought purpose to give life meaning, but ended up turning life into a slave to purpose. Everything that isn't useful feels like loss. Cioran called this the pathology of the duty to be, and that's exactly it. The duty to be someone, to be an example, to be enlightened, when the wisest thing would simply be to be. Perhaps the truest purpose arises when we stop trying to deserve it, when we accept that not knowing is also a path, and that even emptiness has a role in the story. And from that realization comes the next lesson: learning to walk without a map, to dance with the unknown, and to discover that sometimes the meaning of life isn't something to be found, but something to be lost. There is a kind of wisdom that is born when all answers run out, when the mind, tired of trying to understand, finally surrenders to mystery. We live as if meaning were a prize for those who decode life. But perhaps life doesn't want to be decoded, only lived. Sometimes what we most need is not to understand, but to let the inexplicable move through us without demanding explanation. The art of not knowing is the art of trusting without guarantees. It's to look at chaos and still keep going. De Botton reminded us that the greatest philosophical lessons are born from imperfection, not clarity, and it's precisely in imperfection that life reveals its humanity. The problem is that we've been taught to believe that not knowing is failure, when, in fact, it's the beginning of knowledge. And knowledge is liberating. The emptiness that once seemed an enemy begins to change its face. It ceases to be a threat and becomes a horizon. It's there, in that space without guarantees, that the soul breathes. Everything that is alive is uncertain, and everything uncertain is fertile. It is through uncertainty that love, art, faith, and new beginnings are born. The mind wants control. The soul wants surrender. The secret is learning to dance between the two. There is a quiet beauty in simply being here, even without understanding why. Each breath is a reminder that something still pulses, even when reason finds no cause. The meaning of life may never be revealed in words. It hints at itself in gestures, glances, and moments. It's not a concept, it's a state. And like every state, it shifts, moves, disappears, and returns again. And it's when we accept this impermanence that something changes. The weight of having to know dissolves, and living begins to feel lighter. And it's from that lightness, from being present without control, that true purpose is born, not as a goal, but as a consequence of knowledge. Purpose is not something we chase, it's something that reveals itself. When the chasing stops, it is born naturally, like the fragrance of a flower that doesn't need to try to be noticed. De Botton says that happiness is a byproduct of coherence, and perhaps the purpose is the same. It appears when living ceases to be a search and becomes an expression, when you do something, not to prove worth, but because it reflects what you believe. Purpose is the echo of a life lived with presence. We live believing that the meaning of life lies somewhere ahead, but meaning has never been in the future. It manifests in the instant when action and being become one. It's when the gesture is pure, with no intention of applause, that the soul reveals itself. Cioran stated that salvation lies in everything we do not seek, and perhaps that's why the people who most transform the world rarely speak of purpose. They simply live what they are, with wholeness and love. When doing ceases to be a means and becomes an end, everything changes. Working, loving, creating, helping, all of it shines differently when there's no obligation to be grand. Purpose doesn't arise from the size of what we do, but from the truth with which we do it. A sincere conversation can hold more purpose than 1,000 lectures about it. An anonymous gesture can move the world more than a speech full of light. And then, at a certain point, the paradox reveals itself. The less we try to find purpose, the more it finds us. Meaning arises as a natural consequence of those who live awake, present, and vulnerable. It's a silent dance between the self and life, without goals, without promises, without guarantees. And it's precisely there that the journey completes itself, not because it ends, but because it changes form. The search dissolves, and the seeker transforms. Purpose, which once seemed to be somewhere far away, is now in every breath. And it's at that point that the question shifts from what is my purpose to how can I live in a way that purpose is born on its own. Perhaps the greatest act of courage for the soul is learning to live without needing to justify its own existence. Life is not asking you to be useful all the time. It's asking you to be present. Purpose is not a hidden answer. At the end of the road, it's the trail you leave as you walk. It is born when you do what you love, even if no one sees, when you help someone, even without intending to be remembered. Cioran said that lucidity is a curse for those who don't learn to laugh at it. And perhaps that's the secret, learning to laugh at your own search, to not take the meaning of life so seriously. Baudrillard would say that there is nothing more revolutionary than not needing to prove anything, neither spirituality nor purpose. And de Botton, with his philosophical calm, would add, life is good not when it's perfect, but when it's true. So maybe your purpose isn't out there, hidden on some mountain, or in a course. Maybe it's already happening, right now, in your gaze, in the way you listen to someone, in the small choices you make when no one is watching, because living, in itself, is already the purpose. And everything that is born from that presence is what truly transforms the world. But something curious happens when we begin to see everything too clearly. When we understand life deeply, we also realize how much it hurts. To understand the world is often to lose the ability to protect yourself from it. And it's about that weight, the burden of being conscious, of seeing what others ignore, that we'll talk about in the next video. Because seeing too much also tires you, and sometimes all the soul wants is a bit of rest within its own gaze. If this video touched you in any way, you'll find in the comments ebooks that help you understand the themes we've discussed here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. And tell me in the comments, do you feel like you've been living your life with purpose, or out of fear of not having one? Sometimes, the greatest awakening doesn't come when we find answers, but when we finally stop demanding that life makes sense.